in an alternate universe, I don't get bullied in school, and I would also be a Sega kid. So long story short, I did not have any Sega systems growing up. I knew who Sonic was, so I knew Sega because of Sonic, but I didn't own Sega systems. My friends didn't own Sega systems, which kind of made sense, because by the time that me and my friends were old enough to start gaming in any way, the Dreamcast had already been long dead, so I had zero exposure to Sega systems growing up. However, it wasn't until I started collecting that I was like, oh, that's a Genesis, that's a Saturn, that's a Dreamcast. So I know what all those systems are, but it took me a long time to even get like my first Genesis game, right? I still don't even own any Sega systems. But about a year ago, I was on another Japanese game binge and came across a couple Sega games, or Japanese Sega games, that I picked up, and now they're just on the list of games to talk about. So in this first episode, we're going to talk about some games for Sega's earlier systems, and over the next couple weeks, we'll talk about some more games on Japanese Sega systems that I'll never play, but now I have. So let's start with some of the early systems. And the first system overall ever released by Sega was the SG-1000, which was an 8-bit system releasing the same day as Nintendo's Famicom in July 1983, and only in Japan. And you already know how that went, because Nintendo's Famicom dominated the Japanese home console market, so the SG-1000 never really stood a chance. However, the second revision, or more specifically, the third version of the SG-1000 was called the Mark III, releasing in Japan in October 1985. That revision would rebrand and come to North America just a year later in September 1986, but was called the Master System. So I have one Mark III game to show. I never see Mark III games pop up at all, but we'll do this first one today. So Hokuto no Ken is a super famous manga beginning in 1983, but is better known as Fist of the North Star outside of Japan. So if you've heard of Hokuto no Ken, you probably heard of Fist of the North Star instead. I think we've talked about this manga series before elsewhere on the channel, but if you're unfamiliar, the manga started in 1983, and it's about a guy who learns a certain form of martial arts centered around assassination, which sounds super dark, but he uses his powers for good, and he tries to save the weak and innocent in a nuclear war-destroyed world. So the manga is super huge, super famous, and it's expanded into anime, films, books, a musical, of course, and there was one Hokuto no Ken game in 1986 for Japanese home computers. It stuck there, but 2 months later came this July 1986 beat-em-up, also titled Hokuto no Ken, developed and published by Sega, that would come to North America 4 months later in November 1986 as Black Belt. So the Japanese version is nothing more than a 5-level side-scroller in the Hokuto no Ken universe, but it's interesting because the North America release is completely different. The gameplay is the same, but since the Hokuto no Ken license didn't exist out of Japan, they had to completely remove all the branding, so the characters are a little bit more generic, the settings are a little bit more generic, but is, again, essentially the same game. So this game was released very early in the Master System's lifetime here in North America. Wasn't a launch title. It did end up being a launch title for Europe, though, but this game would be included on the Japanese PS2 Sega Ages compilation, on the Japanese Wii Virtual Console in 2008, and it was also it was unlockable in all regions on the 2018 PS4 game Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise. So even if you played Lost Paradise here in North America, you were still able to unlock the original Mark III version as opposed to the unbranded Black Belt version. So that's pretty cool for a single Mark III game for a super famous manga series, but yeah, that's what I got for the Mark III. So next up is Sega's second main system, not just the Master System being a revision. The next big system is the Mega Drive, which is the most famous because even if you haven't heard of the Mega Drive, you've heard of its North American title, the Genesis. So the original Mega Drive was released in Japan in October 1988, but it came to North America a year later in August 1989, again as the Genesis. Now, the Genesis is super famous because even though Nintendo dominated the Japanese market, Sega really cut into Nintendo's North America profits and started like the first console wars in the 16-bit era between like the Super Nintendo and the Genesis, and that was a really big deal. Even if it wasn't necessarily their battle going back and forth like, Sega do and Nintendo don't, even if it wasn't specifically that battle, the console wars got super publicized because both Nintendo and Sega had to go to court in North America over like game censorship. So really famous console wars in the early 90s. Even though Nintendo won, it's still a big deal. So I have two complete in box games to show for the Mega Drive, and the first one is Puyo Puyo 2. So Puyo Puyo itself is a Japanese-born puzzle series starting in October 1991 for the Famicom Disk System. However, its sequel would be released in Japanese arcades in October 1994, and the first home console port would be on the Mega Drive 2 months later in December 1994. However, this specific game would be ported everywhere, even if mostly in Japan, including the Super Famicom port in December 1995, Super Puyo Puyo 2 Remix. So, regardless, Puyo Puyo in general is just sort of like a Tetris, like it's a like a dropping puzzle game. It's popular enough that it's become like kind of a cult following type of game. I personally prefer regular Tetris, but that's not to say that Puyo Puyo is super huge, even if not necessarily here in North America. The game, these two versions are the same base game, but this game wouldn't come to North America at all until the Neo Geo Pocket Color in September 1999. So if you don't know what the Neo Geo Pocket Color is, I don't blame you. It's this really obscure handheld from the very late 90s, of course. So it has been available on a few digital fronts. Otherwise, the Mega Drive version was brought to Japanese Wii Virtual Console in April 2007, but would also come to the North America Wii Virtual Console a year later in March 2008. So it got some love there. The Super Famicom version has also been on Switch Online all over the world since September 2018. So if you want a way to play the sequel to the original Puyo Puyo, you can go on Switch Online and play it there. Honestly, Puyo Puyo just has a super awesome name, probably one of the catchiest names ever in video game history. So it is cool to add 2 more games to the collection, even if one of them is a Super Famicom game in a Sega video. Anyway, the next game, the last Mega Drive game I'm going to show is Shining and the Darkness on Mega Drive, which is a March 1991 dungeon crawler developed by Climax and published by Sega, kicking off the Shining series that would eventually come to North America 7 months later as Shining in the Darkness. So they changed "and" to "in." I don't know. So you play as the main character and 2 of your friends who need to rescue your father and separately the king's daughter from Dark Soul by trekking through 3D dungeons, getting into RPG battles, and hopefully saving characters in each level, with your final outcome being based on how many of those people you saved, which is pretty cool for a game in the early 90s. I don't know how common that was, but still really cool that an early 1991 game was capable of that. The game would be followed by several Shining Force games, so maybe if you don't know this game, you've heard of Shining Force, but this game has also been preserved in a couple of modern ways, like Puyo Puyo. One of them is the Wii Virtual Console in 2007, and also being on a ton of Sega Genesis collection over time. I have a Sega Genesis collection on Switch. I'm pretty sure it's on that, but yeah, really big piece of Sega's early history, and also good piece of gaming history. I only own like 1 Genesis game complete in box that was just kind of gifted to me, but like super cool to get these 2 games complete in box for the Mega Drive, since I'm never actually going to play them, but still cool. So Sega's 4th system was also their first handheld, and that is the Game Gear. So the Master System was 8-bit, the Genesis / Mega Drive was 16-bit, and the Game Gear was supposed to be a portable way to play a lot of those 16-bit games cut down quite a bit. So I don't have a Game Gear to show. I don't own a Game Gear. I don't own any Sega systems. But the Game Gear was released in Japan in October 1990 and North America just 6 months later in April 1991. So the Game Gear had its own specific handheld games for, like, handheld cartridges for the system. But it also wouldn't be Sega's last handheld exactly. There was also the Sega Nomad in 1995 that didn't have its own games, but that was literally a portable Genesis, because the Game Gear, you're going to see in a second, has its own games, but the Nomad was just taking like Genesis cartridges and putting them into the Nomad and playing them on the go. So kind of funny, but those games on the Nomad, or Genesis games on the Nomad, was supposed to be a little bit more accurate than playing, say, these cut down versions of Genesis games. So that's kind of interesting. Sold well. Nothing in comparison to the legendary Game Boy that was on the market at the time, but I got 4 complete in-box Game Gear games, which is kind of funny to come across 4 of them. And yeah, let's start with a weird one. First one is Kunichan no Gen Tengoku, and this game is weird because it's based on a Japanese comedian who is responsible for this game. Like, she exists. Her name is Kuniko Yamada, and the game is starring her. It's a November 1991 minigame compilation, developed and published by Sega, so not just some like random shovelware release for the system, but it's just a minigame collection where you play like Columns, which was another puzzle game at the time, tennis, there's a board game, there's a card game, and I'm pretty sure that's all there is. So that's kind of weird. And that's all I could find about this game, aside from the fact that it had a sequel a year later in 1992. So kind of funny, kind of weird, but yeah, there we go. We'll get to some games that are a little bit more interesting in just a moment, but one more kind of weird one is Putt and Putter, which is a September 1991 isometric mini golf game developed by SIMS and published by Sega, and that's it. It's mini golfing. So it did, however, have a Master System version by the same developer, releasing only in Europe 9 months later in June 1992. So we're going to see sort of this like side-by-side development process happen a couple times in this video, where the Game Gear version releases everywhere, but the Master System version doesn't. And I am pretty sure, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's because like Japan and North America got systems, Japan usually got systems first, North America got it soon, but in the early 90s, Europe was getting systems really late. So by the time that Europe got the Master System, I want to say the Genesis was out or was coming out very soon. So instead of putting out the Master System in Europe and then immediately putting out the Genesis, Sega actually took the initiative to make Master System versions of their Genesis games. So that's also just kind of weird in general, but like what's going to happen a lot, especially a lot in general, but with the next 2 games as well, is that even though like a Genesis game was released in a 16-bit form, it would have like sort of a downgrade version into an 8-bit form for Master System, like only for Europe. So that happened with this game because we didn't get a Master System version. Japan didn't get a Mega Drive version, or sorry, a Mark III version of Putt and Putter, but we got Putt and Putter on the Game Gear, and Japan got Putt and Putter on the Game Gear. So kind of weird, kind of funny, but that's a great stepping stone to the last 2 games, and the most recognizable 2 games in this episode. So the first one is Sonic the Hedgehog 2, and let's be honest, Sonic doesn't need an introduction, but let's first talk about some release history. So the Sonic the Hedgehog 2, as you know it, is the sequel to the Sonic the Hedgehog on Genesis, released in November 1992 in all major regions. However, that 16-bit version was developed by the Sonic team, and this 8-bit Game Gear version was developed by Aspect. They released side-by-side with the Genesis version, also in all major regions, but like Putt and Putter, this also had a Master System version developed at the same time, but only releasing in Europe. Which is kind of weird and is going to happen to the next game too. So as a mainline Sonic game, it's no surprise that it's on every re-release and compilation and every virtual console ever. And even though that's not like generally a lot of info, I mean, it's Sonic, like, early Sonic games. It's not a lot of info, but let's be honest. What is there about Sonic that you don't know? We know Sonic. So it's, like I said, it's interesting to see like an early version of a game being developed on multiple different systems with different developers working at the same time, right? Like the Genesis version is by the Sonic team, but this one was by a completely different team, even though they were releasing at the same time. We see this a lot with like licensed games, like, you know, Battle for Bikini Bottom is released on different systems with different developers and completely different gameplay, but this game is like 10 years before Battle for Bikini Bottom, so kind of interesting, kind of neat. But that brings us to the last game of the episode, and that is, it's falling apart here. That is Sonic and Tails on Game Gear. So again, I want you to remember that Sonic 2 had a Europe-only Master System port, right? Japan and North America got the original Genesis version. We both got the Game Gear version, but Europe only got a Master System port. So the follow-up to that specific Master Port version is this November 1993 game, again developed by Aspect and published by Sega. So it was released in North America 4 days later as Sonic the Hedgehog Chaos, or simply just Sonic Chaos. But Sonic 2's lead development was for the Genesis, and the Game Gear version and the Master System version followed based on the Genesis version. But if I'm not mistaken, this game's development, like its prime development, was for the Game Gear, with a Master System version, again, following along that one. So if I'm not mistaken, that makes this specific game Sonic's first portable game. That isn't like a port or a remake or anything, but I could be wrong. Sonic fans, please don't attack me. But like every other Sonic game, this one was included in future compilations, even if not as extensively as like the mainline Sonic games, but still pretty cool. So yeah, Sonic games require a lot of research. There's like so much info that I probably missed, but still pretty cool. Either way, that is the last game I'm going to talk about now. And like I said, over the next 2, 3, maybe 4 weeks, we're going to talk about some more games that I got for Sega systems. So until then, I'm going to pretend like I actually had a Sega system growing up. And bye!